The sky was a soft, grieving gray that morning. A breeze stirred through the oaks, heavy with silence and the scent of fresh earth. Nathan stood quietly near the edge of the garden, barely 16, too young to know how to bury a brother, too old to cry without shame. He wore James's old scout jacket, the sleeves falling over his hands like memories that didn't quite fit. In one trembling hand, he held a bunch of wildflowers. In the other, James's dog tags, still warm from his pocket. He knelt slowly beside the wooden urn, which sat beneath the oak tree, the one James had climbed as a kid, the one they'd named the Watcher, because it always stood guard over their games, their secrets, their bond. Nathan lowered the flowers with reverence, whispered something only his brother could hear, then pressed his lips gently to the flag-draped box. That's when it happened. The calm was shattered by the sharp command of a voice unfamiliar and authoritative. "Get on the ground. Hands where I can see them." Nathan froze. From every corner of the property, officers flooded in, 6 of them, maybe more, weapons drawn, moving like they were breaching a compound. The gravel crunched beneath heavy boots. Radios crackled. The garden, once a place of peace, now trembled with panic and steel. Nathan's eyes widened in terror. He didn't move. Couldn't. His hands hovered midair, fingers twitching like they were deciding whether to surrender or protect what little remained. I watched from a few feet away, my heartbeat thudding in my throat. I was no longer the Attorney General. I was just a mother watching her only remaining child get mistaken for a threat. The officers surrounded Nathan like he was a suspect in some terrible crime. One barked again, more aggressive now, "Weapon on the ground. On your knees." There was no weapon. Only a boy, his brother's tags, and a grief too big for his body. And it all began because someone, our neighbor Susan, had dialed 911 and uttered a string of words that could get a child killed. "There's a suspicious boy in the yard with a shovel and what looks like a weapon. He's doing something cult-like. I think it's a threat." She didn't see the flag. She didn't hear the song. She didn't even wait for the truth. She just saw something she didn't understand and decided it didn't belong. Susan lived 3 doors down, in a white colonial house where not a blade of grass dared grow beyond regulation height. Her hedges were squared like math problems. Her American flag was lit at all times and ironed crisp. She'd once fined a neighbor for a birdhouse painted in unapproved colors. She was HOA royalty, judge, jury, and executioner of suburban order. To Susan, control wasn't a preference. It was a belief system. That morning, she stood on the edge of her manicured lawn, arms folded tightly across her chest, watching us with the cold scrutiny of someone inspecting a parking violation. Her lips curled into a sneer as she pointed toward our garden. "You can't bury people wherever you want," she yelled. I told her, again, that the land was ours, had been in my family for generations. That it was legally exempt from the HOA's control. That we'd filed the paperwork for a private burial site. That James was a decorated veteran whose last wish was to rest beneath the oak tree he'd loved as a boy. But Susan didn't listen. Susan never listened. All she saw was something that didn't fit the sterile image of Pineview Estates, a grieving boy, a folded flag, and people gathering without her permission. Within 15 minutes, flashing lights appeared at the end of our long drive. I knew something was wrong the moment I saw the first squad car swerve onto the property like it was a crime scene. More followed. The lights painted the trees in red and blue, sirens screaming grief into chaos. Susan was still standing by her lawn, phone in one hand, camera in the other, filming with a smirk. She'd done this. She'd made that call. She told the dispatcher there was a youth in camo holding a weapon, and described our family's private ceremony as a cult ritual on HOA grounds. She knew what she was doing. In a world wired to fear the unknown, she described Nathan in terms designed to provoke: suspicious, armed, threatening. She wanted control, and she tried to claim it with a phone call. What she got instead was a federal response she hadn't anticipated. As the officers closed in on my son, my every instinct roared. But I stayed steady. I stepped forward with deliberate calm, pulling from my jacket the badge I'd carried since the day I swore my oath to uphold the law. I held it up, my voice cutting through the noise. "I'm Elizabeth Carter, United States Attorney General." "Stand down." The lead officer blinked as if I'd slapped him. He went pale. The command in his posture deflated instantly. He looked like a man who had just realized he was standing in a thunderstorm with a metal pole. Around him, the officers hesitated. Radios chirped. A few stepped back. Susan, still filming, laughed from the edge of her lawn. "Oh, please. That's fake," she said, waving her phone. "Anyone can buy a badge on Amazon." But I saw it in the officers' eyes. One leaned toward his partner, muttering, probably verifying my identity. It wouldn't take long. 30 seconds later, the entire tone of the situation flipped. The guns lowered. The shouts faded. Nathan was still on his knees, shaking. I ran to him, wrapping my arms around his narrow shoulders. He hadn't said a word. His face was pale, tear-streaked. In that moment, the powerful truth hit me harder than ever. I could hold the highest law enforcement position in the country, but none of it stopped a scared neighbor from seeing my son as a threat and calling the police. Susan had miscalculated. Not just my title, but my resolve. Our land wasn't some borrowed patch of HOA-controlled grass. It was 5 acres of southern soil, held in my family's name long before the idea of a uniform suburb ever took root. We had records, deeds notarized, dated, and filed. We had federal exemptions for family burial sites and even state permissions for veterans. We had legal right and moral purpose. But none of that mattered to someone like Susan. James had grown up here. He'd climbed the oak, named the squirrels, carved his initials into the bark. He'd laughed with Nathan beneath the leaves, told ghost stories by flashlight, pitched tents with crooked poles, and shared dreams of flying planes and saving lives. When he died overseas, medals on his chest, courage in his heart, his only request was to come home. Not to some impersonal cemetery. Not to a government lot with matching stones. But here, under the oak. We didn't plan a parade. We didn't announce it on Facebook. We didn't invite the town or send out programs. It was simple. A chaplain. A folded flag. A quiet song from a speaker. And Nathan, kneeling with flowers, laying the first piece of color in a garden of grief. That's what Susan disrupted. That's what she mistook for a threat. Not noise or rebellion. Just mourning. For Susan, the HOA wasn't just a governing body, it was her personal empire. She wielded its rulebook like a sword, cutting down anything that didn't conform. Wind chimes too loud? Cited. Lawn 2 inches overgrown? Fined. A child's sidewalk chalk drawing that veered onto a common path? Reprimanded. She had a list, laminated and color-coded, of infractions. She'd delivered it door to door like gospel. And we were her latest offense. That night, after the police had left and Nathan was safely inside, I stood alone beneath the porch light, the air buzzing with something sharper than sorrow, purpose. Grief and fury can be twins, born of the same loss. And while grief had consumed me for weeks, that morning's violation, officers with guns drawn on my son, Susan's smirk as if she'd caught us watering plants off schedule, had cracked something open. I walked the edge of our property in silence, flashlight in hand, camera around my neck. That's when I saw them, 2 black motion-triggered surveillance cameras, carefully hidden but aimed directly into our yard. One mounted on Susan's roofline, the other nestled in a shrub near the fence, angled to catch anyone walking past the oak tree. A deep chill sank into my bones, not from the night air, but from what those lenses meant. This wasn't just nosiness. This was surveillance. I documented everything, zoomed in for timestamps, snapped photos of the wiring, the lenses, the angle of view. The next day, I pulled the HOA's charter, scanned for language about surveillance, trespass, and private property rights. I found what I needed in minutes. Susan was violating privacy laws. She'd already issued a cease and desist letter claiming our burial disrupted neighborhood tranquility, but now she'd crossed into federal territory. I didn't file a lawsuit. I didn't make a speech. I made a single call. David Rains. A veteran DOJ investigator with the appearance of a librarian and the instincts of a bloodhound. He could find corruption in a snowstorm. I trusted him more than anyone in the department. Pine View Estates HOA, I told him. Start with finances. Then dig. Quietly. He paused. What am I looking for? Start with Susan. You'll know the rest when you see it. He gave a dry chuckle and disappeared into his spreadsheets. Susan had opened a door. I intended to walk right through it, with evidence, with precision, with the full weight of the law. Within days, David was texting at strange hours, always short, always ominous. First it was, unusual transfers flagged. Then, vendor accounts fake. Finally, this goes deeper than petty fines. What began as a look into misuse of HOA power quickly became a full-blown corruption case. The books were rotten. Thousands of dollars misallocated. Landscaping charges to vendors who didn't exist. Catering receipts for events that never happened. Payments sent directly to Susan's personal PayPal, labeled Community Morale Enrichment. Worse, she'd manipulated elderly residents, convincing them to prepay for home upgrades through the HOA, only to divert the funds elsewhere. One widow was billed $900 for decorative porch enhancements that never appeared. Another had received threatening notices for non-compliance if she didn't participate in Susan's safety initiative, which turned out to be a glorified dues hike. David's voice was steady but tense when he called. "She's not just power-hungry," he said. "She's stealing." He sent over folders, evidence of falsified citations, backdated approvals, manipulated signatures. And then came the kicker: surveillance. Hidden cameras embedded in decorative birdhouses, trailstones, and even mailbox posts. The footage streamed to Susan's home laptop, hours of neighbors walking dogs, hosting barbecues, playing with their children, unaware they were being watched. It wasn't paranoia. It was real. And it was criminal. I stared at the folders on my laptop long into the night, my fingers tight around a mug gone cold. Susan had built her little empire on fear, manipulation, and a twisted obsession with control. And now she'd handed me everything I needed to take it down. News spreads fast in a neighborhood like ours, where gossip travels faster than mail and morning walks double as reconnaissance. But this wasn't gossip. It was reckoning. At first, the change was subtle. Lawn ornaments in Susan's yard began to disappear. Her signature flamingo, a rigid pink sentry, toppled one morning, neck buried in mulch like it had fainted from the drama. Trash bins once aligned with military precision sat crooked. Her porch light flickered but remained unfixed for days. Neighbors who once feared her now avoided her. Others glanced our way with cautious sympathy. Some waved, small, hesitant gestures of solidarity. The whisper network buzzed. "Did you hear? Did you know? Did she really call the police on a funeral?" Still, Susan doubled down. She posted on the HOA forum, a mess of typos and fury, accusing me of impersonating a federal officer and Nathan of military theatrics. She uploaded grainy photos of him with a flag, tagging them "suspicious youth in camo." One caption read, "Potential crisis actor? Not confirmed." It was absurd. It was dangerous. And it was unraveling. I didn't respond online. I didn't need to. Her paranoia did the work for me. She handed out flyers calling for an emergency HOA meeting, community safety and standards under attack. She walked door to door in a visor and windbreaker like a politician campaigning against grief itself. But when the meeting came, and Nathan and I walked in, quiet, composed, everything shifted. The rec center was packed. Beige walls, folding chairs, the faint smell of lemon cleaner. It felt like a parent-teacher conference crossed with a war tribunal. Susan stood at the front with a microphone, sweat beading her brow. Her PowerPoint, titled Restoring Peace, flicked through slides of citations, surveillance photos, and cherry-picked bylaws. She pointed at us. "An unauthorized funeral took place last week," she said, "involving minors, flags, and potential weapons." I raised my hand. "Our property is exempt," I said. "Deed on file since 1979. State-approved family burial site. Federal protection for military funerals." Nathan opened a folder. "Here's the notarized deed. The exemption. The law." The room went still. People leaned forward. Someone whispered, "Oh wow." Susan tried to pivot. "This isn't about legality," she snapped. "It's about order. About emotional impact. Children saw that flag. Heard the music. So grief needs a permit now?" I asked. Murmurs rippled. One man chuckled. A woman muttered, We didn't know we could ignore her. Susan faltered but called a vote. Should future ceremonies, burials, flags, memorials, require HOA pre-approval? Only 2 hands rose, hers and a loyal crony. The silence that followed was loud. Susan's face flushed. She fumbled to regain control, but the room had turned. The Emperor of Suburbia had no clothes. A few days later, David called. "You'll want to see this." He sent me the final package, a case airtight enough to sink a battleship. We had everything: forged financials, unauthorized surveillance, misused dues, elder exploitation, falsified citations, and the illegal use of HOA funds for personal enrichment. Susan had even embedded microphones in decorative stones lining the public trail, feeding audio directly to her devices. She wasn't enforcing standards. She was orchestrating control. It wasn't just unethical. It was federal. We coordinated with local law enforcement. I handed over a folder labeled Operation Sparrow, a nod to Susan's obsession with birdhouses. The police chief, exhausted from years of petty complaints about mailbox heights and Halloween decorations, raised an eyebrow. "She buries us in nonsense," he muttered. "Fence disputes. Wind chime citations." "She buried herself," I replied. Warrants were issued. Evidence secured. Susan's encrypted drives cracked like eggs under pressure. We scheduled a final HOA meeting, this one public. The weeks after Susan's arrest were strangely quiet, not in the sense of emptiness, but relief. The kind of quiet that comes after a storm finally breaks, after the air clears and people begin stepping back outside, blinking in the light. Neighbors who hadn't spoken in years started waving again. Barbecues returned to cul-de-sacs once ruled by citations. Wind chimes jingled freely, like tiny songs of rebellion. Children rode scooters without fear of noise violations. For the first time in years, Pine View Estates felt like a neighborhood again, not a prison under strict supervision. I was asked to speak at a community gathering, nothing official, just a spontaneous event on the shared green space. Someone brought folding chairs, another set up a speaker. A local veteran played taps on his trumpet. And when it was time, I stepped up, Nathan beside me, James's flag folded in his arms. "I want to thank you," I began, voice steady, "not for agreeing with me, but for finally seeing each other." I looked out at the faces: mothers, widows, teenagers, veterans. People who had once hidden their stories for fear of HOA retribution. People who had buried their grief in silence. We buried my son beneath the oak not because we wanted to rebel, but because it was his home. His childhood. His roots. And if we've learned anything this month, it's that rules without humanity are just chains. Silence settled. "Community isn't compliance," I said. "It's compassion." Applause erupted, not polite, but heartfelt. Some cried. Others stood. Nathan gripped my hand tightly. The war we'd fought was over. Now came the healing. In the quiet that followed, Nathan changed. Not all at once. Not dramatically. But in small, noticeable ways, the way a tree slowly leans back toward the sun after a storm bends it. He barely spoke the week after the standoff. Flinched at sirens. Avoided the oak tree. But I watched him from the window at night, standing near it, sometimes just staring at the urn, other times whispering words I couldn't hear. I tried not to push. Until one night, I found him sketching something, feverishly, like the pencil was a lifeline. It was James's face. Again and again. In uniform. Smiling. Laughing. Holding Nathan as a baby. As if he was trying to remember every angle, every detail. "He wasn't just a soldier," Nathan said softly. "He was my best friend." That broke me more than any citation or trial. We started therapy together. He found a group, other teens with military siblings lost to war. He began speaking, writing, drawing. Then one morning, he hung a framed sketch of James on the oak tree. Beneath it, he wrote, "Still standing watch." And I knew he was healing. Not because justice had been served, but because the truth was finally seen. The courtroom was packed the day Susan stood trial. She wore her usual pearls, though their shine seemed dulled now. Her face was tight, remorse worn like a borrowed coat she didn't quite know how to button. Her lawyer tried to paint her as misguided but well-meaning. But the evidence was irrefutable. The financial fraud, the hidden cameras, the harassment. Victims testified, elderly neighbors she'd bullied into silence, parents fined for minor violations, a teen boy wrongfully labeled a threat. When it was my turn to speak, I faced her squarely. "You didn't just abuse your power," I said. "You redefined what fear looked like in this neighborhood. But fear doesn't build communities. It burns them down." The judge handed down a sentence that made headlines: 18 months federal time, 5 years probation, and a lifetime ban for managing any HOA or private governing board. But the real sentence? She left in silence. No supporters. No farewell. Her reign ended not with applause, but absence. And Pine View Estates, once her kingdom, moved on without her. In the months that followed, the community chose not to rebuild the HOA. Instead, they created something new, a neighborhood council, voluntary, rotating, inclusive. No fines. No citations. Just voices, ideas, and respect. Gardens blossomed with colors never before approved. Porch swings reappeared. Flags of all kinds flew, veteran flags, pride flags, family crests. Children played late into the evening, chasing fireflies where once they'd been silenced. And beneath the oak, people began to leave things, not out of sadness, but remembrance. A painted rock with James's name. A toy plane. A folded letter sealed with a ribbon. Even a tiny lantern that lit up at dusk. It became a quiet monument, not just to James, but to resilience. Susan had tried to erase stories that didn't match her rulebook. Instead, she'd inspired a community to write new ones. On the 1-year anniversary of James's burial, we held a small remembrance. Just family, a few neighbors, and the quiet hum of wind through the branches. Nathan read a poem, his own. It spoke of loss, yes, but also hope. When he finished, he turned to me. "I want to go into law," he said. "Not because of you, Mom, but because I want to make sure people like her never get to decide what grief looks like again." I smiled, tears catching in the corner of my eye. "You'll make a damn fine one." We stood beneath the oak, the leaves whispering like memories. The sun dipped low, casting golden light over the urn, the flag, the sketch. James had come home. Nathan had found his voice. And I had kept my promise, not just to my son, but to the truth. The flag still waved on our porch. Not out of defiance, but as a reminder. Justice doesn't always come in courtrooms. Sometimes, it begins with a child holding flowers and ends with a community remembering who they are.